Hello everybody, we are working on Chapter 4 tonight, and I'm going to begin by doing a brief lecture. I'm hoping to go through the chapter quickly to maybe clarify some real key concepts here that might not be very clear in the previous videos that are recorded. The other videos that are posted in the course shell, the archive videos, those are detailed lectures, and I encourage you to listen to them or watch them, and also read the book in detail. All right, let's get started by just jumping through the chapter here. CSS has been around for a while. Really, the point of CSS was to separate the styling components from HTML. HTML, in its initial drafts, included tags, such as the font tag and other tags, where you could try to control appearance to some degree, and it was mostly for typography, and it was very primitive and didn't work well. So they came up with this idea of adding cascading style sheets, and that actually stems from the same technology HTML does, and that's from the SGML, where the challenges for pre-press was that you would create content, and if you're printing a newspaper or a magazine, and you can even look at the book that I have up on screen right now, you have things that are headings, you've got dividers, some things are bold, some things are italic, some are bullets. And how do you do that in a markup language so that you can get the formatting out of it? So HTML can do some things, but with HTML5, you have to remember the concept of semantics and the separation of concerns. And the separation I want you guys to try to kind of intrinsically build into the back of your head is HTML is for structure and content, right? Not for style. CSS is for style and behavior, and JavaScript is for action and dynamics. Some of those things do overlap between CSS and JavaScript and HTML, but the ideal is to separate all those things from each other. CSS did go through several different drafts until we got up to CSS Level 3, and we've been there for a while. And CSS Level 3 has some really significant and important features that really kind of pushed us to be able to have HTML5, basically. It's one of the things that kind of unlocked that capability, because we were removing the styling components, in most cases, completely from HTML. And it's a hard habit for coders to break, including myself, where I can put a border on a table by saying border equals 1, right? But the preferred way to do it really is in CSS. You should really not put that in your HTML at all. That's the preferred approach. But the thing that CSS3 brought to the mix that's unique are these bullet points that we're seeing here. Media queries is a huge one. Why media queries? Media queries basically allow us to probe the device that we're pushing our page to and read what kind of browser it is, what its dimensions, usually the width of the screen, and then relative to that, we can do a conditional statement that says, if we're from this wide to that wide, we're going to use this CSS, or if it's under that size, let's switch to a different CSS. And what that allows us to do, basically, is to create pages that look good on big screens and create pages that look good on handheld devices. Why is this important? What percentage of browsing happens on mobile devices, would you suspect? It's huge. Now, I recall this because I went to this conference back right before I actually started working at Gateway. It was like summer of 2013, and it was a graphic arts conference, and they had all these big players there like Google and Microsoft, and they had a person there from Google that put forth a piece of information that I found really kind of striking. And this was back, now mind you, 5 years ago, pushing on 5 years ago, that they did research and discovered that people sitting in their own homes, right? So you're sitting at home on the couch or whatever, wherever you are in the kitchen, and the primary way that people were surfing the internet was on their mobile devices, not on their laptops, not on their desktops. So at that time, 5 years ago, they were estimating 70 to 75% of surfing at home was happening on handheld devices, tablets and phones. I cannot imagine that number has decreased, right? So as web designers, we have a problem. We work on these big screens all the time. You have to be really cautious about designing stuff that looks good on a big screen, but does not work on a mobile. If you know that 90% of your traffic is going to come from somebody's phone, well, you better be coding probably for the phone first. And it was at that point that Google was discussing the concept of mobile first in their search engine. And it took them a couple of years before they actually implemented it, and it's been about 2.5 years now, I think, where they said that sites that are mobile friendly will get priority in the search engine listings over non-mobile friendly sites. And it really is an intelligent choice. I look at the way my wife and kids surf. Now, I can't do it. My wife will send me links via text so I can read an article about how to be a better husband or something like that. Hint, hint on Valentine's Day. Right? I can't do it. I cannot read for a long period of time on my phone. I just won't do it. I can watch a video. I can watch like a whole movie on here, no problem. But to read something, it hurts my eyes. That's just me. But my wife and kids, oh my God, I can't pry the thing out of their hands. And in fact, if you ever want to punish your kids, folks, take their phones away. All right? It works really well. Okay, fine, Dad, I'll do whatever you want. All right, the other thing that's important is this concept of what we call namespaces. Namespaces are really what I like to think of as an encapsulation naming method. A namespace is nothing more, in most cases, than taking blocks of code and applying a name to it, so that therefore you can refer to the contents within it with a unique identifier. And I'm not going to say much more about that until you see like how some of the selectors work. But basically, that's a huge advance in how we do styling, because not only can we pick out tag names, because in the early versions of CSS you could only apply a style to like a paragraph or a H1. And then eventually you could apply it to a class or an ID. But now, using namespaces, it gives us this complicated way where we can either custom apply certain naming techniques to selectors, or use some of these higher level ones, which is one of the reasons I'm recording this video, is to help clarify things like, sibling selectors and adjacent selectors, and the fact that CSS has this capability now to not only apply styles to content, but it also has the capability of doing things that look like JavaScript and insert actual content onto a web page. Those are pretty powerful. In fact, in the past, the only way we could do those things outside of HTML was with JavaScript. All right, so some of these capabilities, because of namespaces and the selectors, we are able to do some more advanced things. The other thing that's kind of interesting as well are some of the coloring and styling elements that are available. And I wish they actually would add probably another bullet here, because, for example, if you ever worked in a graphics program, right, and I kind of come more from that world originally as a developer from a graphics standpoint, and for a number of years I taught at the Art Institute, so we always would try to say, like, how can we make our web page look like this Photoshop thing I just did, right? Like where I have a little text shadow, and there's some light coming in, and I can draw a box around something, and I can really make it pop with just really a couple of very simple styling techniques, appropriate colors, transparency, and those things all came in with CSS3. Initially, like HTML5, poorly supported. Chrome supported some things, Safari supported others, Firefox others, Microsoft, well, they were doing whatever they wanted, and usually most of the stuff didn't work. Now I can safely say that almost all of the CSS3 stuff that I've been looking up and working with in the past that was buggy works completely well in all of the browsers, with the exception, of course, of Internet Explorer in its older versions without like the modernizer libraries. But even with the modernizer libraries, sometimes those don't work. Okay. If you want to find out, and I think I showed you this last week, but I'm going to show it to you again, there's a website called Can I Use that is your friend if you're doing CSS styling or working with HTML tags. So like in the old days, if I wanted to do something like, box shadow, and you see it found it right away, and you have to type the whole thing, we'd come down here and we'd look at all the different browser versions and see that it like didn't work in like most of the stuff, or boxes weren't green, they were yellow. But now you see the only thing that's not supporting it is Opera Mini. All right, but if you would have looked at this 5 years ago, most of these were red and yellow. Chrome supported it and Safari supported it, and that was really about it. And then they didn't all support them the same way. So we've really come a long way with this stuff. But this is a great site. So whenever you see a new tag or one that you don't know how to use, or you're concerned that you're pushing out something that people aren't going to be able to see, please come to this site and check it. And of course, even if this site says it's good, guess what? You should still be checking it. As web designers, you must have Firefox installed, Chrome installed, Internet Explorer installed, Edge, Opera. What else am I missing? Yeah, but we're missing Safari, which is the major Apple browser. Yeah, you do need a Mac in order to do that one. Although, what this is... Did they bring it back? Because it went... Yeah, it went away. That's what happened. It was supported on Windows up until a few years ago, and then they stopped upgrading it. And it's not safe to use a browser that's not upgraded. All right, so you cannot get Safari on Windows. However, I think that you can now get, and don't quote me on this, you think you can get Edge on a Mac. You might want to check that. On iOS you can, okay. I don't know about the Mac OS. I haven't tried it myself. Should we really be concerned about a browser like Opera? I think you should be. Because Opera has this really strange cult following. And Opera, even though it's kind of a neglected browser, it's never had more than a couple percentage points market share, it's one of the innovative browsers. It's the one that came up with tabs. It came up with the developer modes. It came up with view sort. I could go on and on. They came up with all the really cool tools way back before they even caught on. I mean, the concept of tabs, would you even want a browser that doesn't have tabs? Right? So just to give you an idea, so even though they're not like a leading edge browser, and actually I'm kind of surprised I don't see like the full-blown Opera browser listed here. Is that a mistake? Or is it because I'm not expanding too far? Very fascinating. But notice now what they're doing is on the far right side here, we have Chrome for Android. So the Chrome browser on your phone or your tablet is different than the Chrome browser that's on your PC or your laptop. And there's also browsers by Samsung, like if you buy a Samsung phone, well now you get the Chrome browser I think by default, but they also have their own browser, and UC browser for Android, I'm not even familiar with that one. But those aren't the only browsers out there, folks. Do you know there's many, many others? Yeah. And some of them are pretty good. You guys ever hear of Dolphin, for example? Yeah. So don't be afraid to explore. I mean, clearly we know which ones are the most popular. What does everybody use? All right, so I hear a mix. A lot of developers do use Firefox for good reasons, but Chrome is still definitely the leading choice. All right, another really important thing with the color aspect of this is the fact that we do have multiple ways of declaring colors now that we did not have in the past. In the past, the only way to declare color was with hex codes. Then they came up with abbreviated hex codes, so instead of 6-digit, they made like 3-digit ones. And then they also added into the mix the RGB and then the HSL. And if you guys don't know what those are, we will see that shortly. So hopefully you do know those things. Real basic approach to applying any styles is to have a selector. That's what comes before the curly brackets there. So you see like the body tag. And that, of course, would apply to the entire body of the document. Then you have the property that you're going to affect, and then what you're affecting it with. Notice the syntax. I think you guys are familiar with this stuff enough already, so I'm not going to belittle it. If you are going to add comments to the mix, you can use this approach. This commenting approach is common to a lot of programming languages. Usually most curly brace-based programming languages will use this as a commenting technique. The other commenting technique that also works is the double slash at the beginning of a line, but I'm always really cautious with that one. I prefer the slash star star slash approach. I think that's a better approach in general. Another thing that I want you guys to get in the habit of is when you are styling things and you're doing it manually with CSS, don't delete your revisions. Comment out, like if you're changing colors or changing fonts, leave the previous version there, just comment it out. It's easier to remove the comment marks and go back to what you had rather than retype it again, right? And often I'll do that for an entire project where like half of my CSS code is all comments, like stuff I tried and didn't work, that type of thing. And another technique that you can use with comments that's very effective, like you see, for example, he says background color white, RGB value is. One technique I got into, especially with working with content management systems like WordPress, right? And I'll work with somebody's pre-built template, and they got like 10,000 lines of CSS, media queries, all sorts of weird stuff, and you're just in there to change one line, right? And then good luck finding that line again. So one technique I would come up with is I would put a comment at the end of the line, just like with my initials or something, a little identifier that I could just do a Control F to search, type in my initials, and it pops right up. And I don't have to go hunting around the page for it. And another thing I would stick in the comments is just like, for example, is anything that might help me understand why I did what I did. I did that especially in the early days of CSS3 where we would have to use browser prefixes. You guys are familiar with those, I assume? If you're not, I know that the chapter does talk about them somewhere, but this is still, and actually I don't want to say browser specific, I want to say prefixes on purpose. All right, and here's just a really quick list. I did this because I know Google just pops it right up like that. So depending on what browser you're using, you do have some styles that might not natively work. We are getting to the point, I'm going to tell you that I don't think these are as necessary as they used to be, but you might run into legacy code where you see this all over the place. So for example, when I was talking about box shadow, in the old days, the only way I could kind of get it to work was to address each browser with a prefix. So you put in a dash, and then you put in, you see for WebKit, Android, Chrome, and Safari, and iOS. Isn't that curious? They all run on the same engine, folks. Yes, they do handle a few things differently, but they're basically the same engine underneath. So they have the same code base. Mozilla, Firefox, MOZ stands for Mozilla, which used to be Netscape. MS for Internet Explorer, right? Opera is O. What about Edge? All right, so often what you do is with a style like box shadow, and I don't know if they have a built-out example here on this website, but let's just, for example, just look at this code, which does seemingly a little bit of animation. You guys see what's happening to my browser right now? I'm like trying to scroll down, then it pops and moves around. You know why that happens? No, that's because when they put their images on the page, they're not including the height and width of the image. So the space isn't reserved, and then the image loads and takes up the space, and the text moves. That's a good little thing to know. All right, anyhow, if you look at this, this would be a common thing that we would see, is that if you wanted to get a certain type of style to work, you wanted to make sure that you listed each type of browser and applied the same exact style. Seems kind of silly. And at the very bottom, you would add the basic style. So try this one if it's this browser, try this one if it's that browser, keep going down the list, and if none of that works, try the bottom one. And it has to be done in that fashion. So in the past, when we used advanced CSS, we would almost always have to do this to make it kind of work. And that's not very comforting as a designer, right? When you're trying to get a specific look. And that's why a lot of people did not lean very heavily on CSS3, I would say until the last couple of years. Now, we can actually count on box shadow working, count on certain colors and transparencies working properly. Okay, let's go back to the book. All right, styles can be applied in a few different ways. This is an inline style where we actually take the tag, add the style attribute, and put in our CSS content directly into the tag. Generally speaking, this should be avoided. If you're hand coding a site, you should try to avoid this like the plague. All right. However, when things are not working, sometimes this is the only way you can get it to work. And the reason for that is an inline style always has the most precedence in the cascading styles. It is directly attached to the tag that it's affecting. So it will supersede whatever's at the top of the document or in an external document. Now, there are circumstances when you work in this field where you will be working, for example, in a content management system where you are locked out of the CSS. You can create content and you can drop in HTML code and JavaScript and all sorts of stuff into like a WordPress entry. Think of, WordPress, those of you that have done that. And the only way I could style something, because I have no access to the CSS, is to do an inline style. So it's kind of like a cheat in a way, but there is a use for this. Okay, but if you can, the ideal is to avoid doing that. External style sheets are the preference. Then, of course, we do have the embedded style sheet, and that is the one that's at the top of the document within the head tags and within style tags. And then once you're within those style tags, you can use the standard CSS language, and then that CSS will apply to that page only. If you are finding yourself using this technique, which should generally also be avoided, or if you see, for example, that you're saying background color white and color gray on every page, well, that's a clue right there. You should put it in an external style sheet, right? Because it's redundant. You're repeating code, and it does not help efficiency. Another thing I want to make you guys aware of is if you ever go to a complicated website, and you might do this once in a while, and you'll see that there's all this CSS like embedded right onto somebody's page, and it's like, why are you doing that? A lot of times that's generated by a server that injects it into a page. The coders did not do it that way. It's the software on the back end that's doing it. All right. The preferred way, of course, is to use an external style sheet. The same is true with JavaScript. Separation of concerns, HTML for structure and content, CSS for styling, JavaScript for actions. This is what we consider the correct syntax. I see that here in this book, they're using single quotes around the attributes. Now this I find fascinating because I was using Dreamweaver the other day, and I've been kind of going back to that product a little bit more than usual. And its on-the-fly debugger yelled at me and said, it's incorrect to use single quotes on, like, the rel tag. And I was like, how is that incorrect? I always thought you could use either one. But apparently W3 does have a preference. And I think that the reason for that is because there was somewhere else in the link that they were using a single quote, and so it flagged it against me, if that makes sense. All right, so this is considered the proper format. The href tag is the one that actually points to the document. I always encourage people when you're using a tool like Visual Studio or Dreamweaver that you just do simple drag and drops or right clicks and find the source so that you get exactly the right syntax. Don't guess. Because there are a few browsers, especially older ones, that if you're missing, for example, the rel tag, they won't render. It's and that can be kind of maddening because you'll look at it and you go, looks fine to me, I don't know what's wrong. So just make sure that you do that. All right. Now, another thing that's really huge with HTML5 and CSS3 is the fact that we have lots of different types of devices that we can push to. Our naive state of mind is that we have desktops, laptops, tablets, and phones, and we're done. Wrong. People that are blind surf the web. People that are deaf surf the web. Now, that's really kind of mind-boggling if you start to think about it, right? But you know what? If you work for a government entity, all of their websites must be able to be read by people with those disabilities. Do you guys ever go to the Gateway website and you see that they got these little things where you can change everything to text? Blackboard does it too. Why? Because it's required by law. So there are people that actually surf the web using different types of devices. And you know what? We often neglect things like game systems. Now we can push to, refrigerators, right? You guys go to Best Buy, right? And you got you can touch the screen to look inside your fridge, and then it can order the milk for you. Yeah, that's a for real technology, folks. It's been around for a while, actually. There's also the possibility, and this is one that you probably were taught in Web 1, maybe even experimented with a little bit, that you can write CSS that's for print. And that's actually a technique I used quite a bit, where I would create like e-commerce websites, and then I would also get tasked with creating a print catalog. And I started thinking to myself, boy, that's really redundant, because I'm creating this content, now I'm recreating this content again. Why don't I just write some CSS so that that web page omits the menu bars, omits the sidebars, and little parts of the ads, and just prints the product, inserts page breaks, switches from pixels to points for printing, and makes it look nice on a printer, so that if somebody wanted to print out our products on a page so they could show it to their mom who doesn't surf, they could do it. Right? So that's actually kind of a big area too. Not everything needs to get printed. I mean, I remember the old days of email and surfing, where people would find a really cool web page and they'd print it out. Yeah, that sounds ridiculous now, I hope, or hopefully you guys aren't doing that practice, but I would encourage you real strongly to think in a non-paper based format. And paper does have its place, but you know, we have this technology so that we don't have to use it. It's really very wasteful. All right, we have screen readers. Those are the things that read it out loud. You have Braille readers. Very fascinating, all the different formats. But just please keep in mind that you might get yourself into situations where you have to author for different devices. But what you'll see most common in terms of different types of CSS might be something like this, where you will get both something for the screen and something for a printer. And if they know that somebody is coming in with a TTY device or a Braille device, you'll see those in the mix as well. Well-written CSS, folks, really, via media queries and device probing, can actually, one document can do all of it. But the media queries can get tricky. Do you have to have just one style sheet for a page? Could I have 10 style sheets for the same page? Yes. Why? All right, well, think of like if you're designing a site and you came up with a really killer-looking menu system, right, that you use on all your projects. Maybe change the colors or the fonts a little bit, but it's the same basic menu system. You would have a CSS style sheet that would attach to that, and that could travel with all your projects. So you could pick up your HTML code, pick up your CSS code, and just bring those to whatever project, and you don't have to copy your CSS and put it into a separate file. They will work fine together. The only caution there is the cascade. Because if I have a style that's addressed in one style sheet, and then I list another style sheet that gives it a different style, guess which one will count? The last one. That's an important thing to know. Also happens within a style sheet itself. Sometimes people will make the mistake where they'll have like a paragraph style up here for font, and then they forget and they put it down at the bottom again. And which one counts? The last one read. Okay. So hopefully that helps a little bit. In the old days of CSS3, when we first started out with it, we would actually have to add this to the top of every CSS file. That now is assumed. I still see documents with it out there, and in fact, if you use an older editor that pre-generates your CSS files, it might even throw that in. But it's there for the same reason it's on an HTML page, to make sure that it recognizes the character set that you're using. We are fortunate, folks, all this stuff is coded in English, right? Not Mandarin Chinese, right? But UTF-8 ensures certain character sets so that it's read correctly. On an HTML document, now we also throw this in, but you notice that this is the old XML namespace, that's what that stands for XHTML, even though we're talking about HTML5. And this meta tag now is really kind of reduced to meta character set equals UTF-8 done. You don't need all that other gobbledygook in there. But with XHTML you did. Now you guys have seen this, so I'm not going to belittle it. It is possible as well to include style sheets within style sheets. This is kind of a novel concept. I don't see it very often used. So usually if I have an HTML page and I want to bring 6 style sheets into it, I just create the 6 links and I'm done, right? But it's also possible that from the style sheet itself that I can include other style sheets with an import tag. What's fascinating about that import tag is you can also use it in the HTML page. I see it used very rarely, but it is something that people do on occasion use. And very often in situations like this, and kind of like what I was talking about before, like where you create a custom menu, right? And you have that's a separate document. And here I am working on this page. Well, I'll just import that in and we're done. And then on my HTML document, I have one link and it covers it all. So it's importing your style sheet, which is importing the style sheet. Pretty cool, actually. But once again, something I see used pretty rarely, but it is there and it does work in all the browsers. So something to know. All right. This is one that's kind of interesting too, and now you guys might not be in the habit of using this. In the old days, we'd go create websites, right? And our typography was pretty limited. In fact, we had what we called web-safe fonts, and you guys probably learned this in HTML1, I hope, but maybe not, or maybe not completely. And we had a list of fonts in the old days that we could count on being present on any system. And boy, that has taken a while to load. All right, finally loaded. And one thing that we used to do as designers very often is we would have to stick to the fonts that you're seeing listed here. And you can Google this for yourself and take notes. And you see it's actually not a very large list. And the point of this was basically that there was only certain fonts that we could count on being present on certain systems. And on top of it all, some of these fonts were present on Macintosh machines, and some of them were present on PCs, and often not on both. So we would get into this situation where we would be authoring, and we would have to do something like Arial, comma, Helvetica, comma, sans serif, right? Why? Let's see if it's a PC. Arial, good. Okay, it's not. Let's see if it's a Mac. Helvetica, good. Oh, no. Okay, well, give me something sans serif. Last ditch effort, right? So that's what we would do. Now the font sets have really increased significantly on both platforms, where all the fonts you've seen listed here will appear on both machines, without a doubt, right? You know, if it's like, you know, made like pre-2005, maybe not. But you can be pretty self-assured that the fonts will be there. But what's also happened is when we would want to do something really fancy, so I'm going to actually go to Google Fonts, and you guys should have this as kind of a resource, and maybe you've learned this technique already. And this is one of many online font repositories. The Google Font repository is a really good one because all the fonts are free. There are actually fonts out there that if you want to use, you do have to pay for them. And some people will take that step and pay. I mean, people have to create these things, they should earn money for them. I mean, it really is kind of the way it is. So let's say you were trying to come up with something that was really unique and bizarre looking. You know, so I'm going to the display fonts here. So you could create like that, you know, really cool look, something like this, right? And it used to be if you wanted to create a logo with like a font like that, you would go into Photoshop or Illustrator, and you'd create it as a graphic and save it as a JPEG or a PNG, and then you put that as your logo on your page. You do not have to do that anymore. Why? This is really pretty important because we would create logos for companies like Coca-Cola, right? But that would not be searchable as text. So you're creating this content that looks really cool, but it has no impact on Google search results. Here you can create a logo that says the name of the company, is still read as text, and still gives you the look you want. And this can be done a number of different ways. One thing that you can do is you can go in here and you can actually choose the font you want, like I'm doing right now. And then I'm going to go into this interface here, and I can follow the several different techniques that they list. So, you know, notice they have a couple different approaches there. So they have the embed approach, which basically means that on my HTML document, I'm going to include this link that I'm pointing to right now. Right? And then in my CSS, whether it's on the page or an external file, I would then declare that font family by name. I'm naming that font. And then every time I call upon that font in my CSS, it links out to Google and pulls the font in and drops it into my page. Pretty cool, right? Some people, though, will say, well, that's not really very safe. What happens if the internet's not working? Well, my answer to that typically is like, well, if the internet isn't working, they're not seeing your page anyhow, right? Jason, you're thinking like me. So we've gotten to the point now, for the most part, I consider this kind of a moot point. We used to caution people against this, and the workaround for it was that you would actually download the font files, include them in your files with the project, and you would link to them locally rather than link to what's out on Google. But, you know, in my mind, whose servers are more apt to be running, Google's or yours? All right. So I think this is like a really good approach.
I feel benefit to do it with the doodle and kind of download and put it in your own.
Is there?
Yeah, so only actual benefit to do it to the doodle pod thing, because let's say if you have one page that has the doodle pod and you have the other page that has the hand doodle pod, you're like, oh, I already downloaded this pod. I don't need to download it to that.
That's exactly correct. And that's a really intelligent response. So like if I'm pulling in a font from Google on one page, and it's another one that somebody else is using, it gets cached on your system too, and it actually will load pretty quick.
Yeah. But if you download it and post it to your own portal, then it downloads, oh, I got to re-download this font, but I don't already have it, and you won't fit reading it by 5 minutes.
Well, what's interesting about that too, Alex, is in the old days, the fonts were not well supported. So if you did download font files, there were certain ones that worked with PCs, certain ones that worked with Macs, certain ones that worked with certain browsers. So now you're getting into the situation like what the book is pointing out, which is that often you would have to download multiple font formats. So the approach that they're showing here in the book is assuming that you have the font files stored in your folders. And then I have the TTF for most of the machines, Macs and PCs, and then the EOT for Internet Explorer. And it was really a goofy thing to do. My strongly preferred way to do it is to use a repository like Google Fonts if you want a very specific font. They're all free. Like I said, there are companies that have pay versions for fonts, so you can actually buy them and download them, and some people do that. And then if you use products like the Adobe Creative Suite, they have their own complete set of fonts. And I'm going to tell you what, those are really beautiful fonts, and I love using those on my web pages because I think they look a lot better than some of the Google fonts. But you have to be bought into their system to be able to access it. The font library is actually free, but you can't link to it from your product, your Adobe product, unless you buy in. Right, Jason? Yep. But they are beautiful fonts. Yeah, then you have to pay it. But there's certain ones, but they have that are so nice looking that I often lean on those as kind of a really good fix for websites. All right, we're going to continue on now, and we're going to start talking about probably one of the concepts that confuses most people, and that is not just selectors, but really the higher level selectors that are new with CSS3. And I'm hoping that we can clarify some of those things for you. So let's go through the basics really quick. Generally speaking, a selector can be in a few different forms. The most common ones, of course, are applying selectors that are equivalent to the tag that's present inside of HTML. So this one here would apply to a button tag, or if I wanted a paragraph tag, and then you just use the plain old name of that tag in all lowercase. And then inside the curly brackets, of course, you apply your styles. You can also apply the styles using an ID selector. An ID selector is prefaced by a pound sign, and I always remember that versus the dot for the class by, ID number, and the pound sign kind of stands for number. That's how I always remember it. So pound sign indicates ID. You can also apply to a class selector. Class selector, of course, is an attribute you add to a tag that is prefaced with a dot in CSS to indicate that it's a class. One thing you have to remember about IDs, IDs on HTML tags can occur only once on a page. You can't use them twice. If you do, you have very unpredictable results. Sometimes it'll work and sometimes it won't. Sometimes it can be disastrous, actually. A class, however, can be applied to multiple items, and I think I mentioned this in previous weeks. You can also apply multiple classes to any particular tag, and that's actually a technique that's used pretty often. All right. So they have some examples here of how to apply those, which I'm sure you guys are already familiar with. We also have what we call the universal selector, which can be used in a number of circumstances. My favorite usage for this, which I've mentioned in previous weeks, is, for example, to apply the universal selector to margin and padding and set them both to 0. The reason I do that is to take away the default styles that are applied to certain elements so that I can override and control things to pixel perfect control. Sometimes your designs will fight you because of the styles that are built in to certain tags. The H1 tag, for example, right? What does it do? It makes things bigger, bolder, and puts space, actually padding, around the text. I can override that and then control that spacing myself. But when you take away a style, you always have to add it back. That's one thing that you should know. All right, let's talk about what they call descendant selectors, and this one is actually pretty common as an approach. Now, as a rationale for using this type of a tag, I always like to tell people, this allows you to build, for example, an HTML that is not burdened with class selectors and ID selectors. So, for example, if I have list items on a page that are either part of an unordered list or an ordered list, and I want to style the anchor tag or the link within it, and I just don't want them to be underlined, I can apply this to all of those in that situation. So the way that this really reads is, and I always like to go with these backwards instead of forwards, that's how my mind works on it, is all the anchor tags or all the links inside any list item will not be underlined. That's what this does. So that's a descendant selector, with the anchor tag being a descendant of the link tag that it's sitting within. That's the wording there. Here's one that's a little bit more complicated, right? So it would be an anchor tag that sits inside of a list item, inside of an ordered list, inside of a div, but only that one, right? If it was inside of a paragraph, no go. Or if it was an unordered list, no go. Does that make sense? So all this does, when there's no commas and there's no little extra punctuation in there, it's one that is sitting inside of the other in order descending. So this is the most outermost element, next outermost, and then you're working your way in. Yes, Susie? There's different schools of thought. Okay, I would say that the reason they developed this is so that you can actually forego the use of classes if necessary. So you could have somebody write real basic HTML and still control things very specifically because of their structure, right? And that is if the structure is predictable. That tends to be on larger websites and websites that are built on engines like WordPress, where it'll generate things in a certain fashion. I will still see most designers will prefer to use classes and IDs though, because they'll just say, well, I can just put an ID on my anchor, or a class on my anchor tag and do the same thing, right? Yep. Yeah, you absolutely can. But that's kind of interesting. But think about environments in which you might be working in a team and you are locked out of the HTML. Then what do? Right? Yeah, then you use this approach because they spend a lot of time building this HTML. You're going to go in and drop in a class tag and break something, and then we got to fix it. So that's why they came up with these types of scenarios, folks. All right, let's talk about this, right? How is this different than what we saw before? So this is what we call a child selector, right? So this is a little bit different. Now, for as cumbersome as it is, I'm going to actually read this to you. All right, it says you might want to change the style of elements only if the elements are direct children of another element. I want you to think about that for a second. Wasn't that the case before? Wasn't that the anchor tag inside of the list item? Well, so we're making this assumption. We have a list item, and there's some text inside of there, and there's an anchor tag, right? So it sits inside and it works. But what if that list item contained a div, and that div contained a paragraph, and that paragraph contained an anchor tag? This style would not apply. What this one tells us with that little pointy sign, or greater than sign, is that that anchor tag has to be a direct descendant. So there's no other tags in between. It's the anchor tag that sits directly inside the list item. It's not inside of a paragraph inside the list item. It's not inside of a div. And hopefully that will make a little bit more clarity to you. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. So kind of, once again, looking at this approach, all of these would need to be direct descendants. So the ordered list would have to sit at the highest level inside the div, not inside of another element. The list item, same thing. The anchor tag, the same thing. So really what it does is it really drills down and makes it specific. So if I had a div, and then there was a paragraph sitting in between, and then I put it in my ordered list, something you really wouldn't want to do anyhow, but I'm just putting it out there. Or maybe you have a div and then another div. Well, no, that wouldn't work. I'm trying to think of a scenario. You could come up with scenarios, but basically what this does is it drills down and it forces it to be a direct descendant instead of being encapsulated inside something else. How often do I see this used? It really varies pretty widely. Generally speaking, I still think people prefer classes and IDs because it makes more sense to them. Well, this is telling us that this ordered list, as long as it's somewhere inside this div, will work. But if I had, let's say, this would still work, the other one will not. Excellent. That's the way to understand it. All right. Now let's talk about pseudo classes and these funky new selectors that they have. And I'm going to talk about these here, kind of show you this list. And some of these you actually learned in Web 1, right? Like you guys learned how to do anchor tags, and then they show you how to create hover effects, and they have like link, visited, active, and hover, and those are usually the ones that you learn first, and usually associated with an anchor tag. But here's what's kind of interesting about these, and what a lot of designers completely don't even think about. We learn that we can put hover, and wherever I have a link and I move my mouse to it, I can like change the color or make it bold or whatever it does. But that link or hover, can be added to any element. It doesn't have to be on a link tag. I could put that on a paragraph, and when I hover over the paragraph, make the whole paragraph highlight. That's kind of interesting, right? And then when you start to like ramp that up and think of all the different kind of CSS styles you could apply, I could actually hover over a paragraph or an H1 and even affect different elements. Now that kind of gets kind of interesting. So don't limit yourself in thinking that that's just for an anchor tag. It can be used in many scenarios. Clearly, link, visited, and active are ones related to links. But the hover one really can be used over a lot of different things. There's a few other ones here that are kind of weird. What's focus? Well, focus means whatever is on the page that currently has the attention of the browser. And one thing I'm going to demonstrate for you, and this is kind of interesting, for those of you that are mouse users like me, right? All right, and I'm going to try to find a website that's simple and clean, and of course I won't find one. So here I am. and I'm going to click in the address bar. Right now, by clicking in the address bar, you see it's highlighted? That has focus. See attention. If I start typing something, or I press enter, that's what's going to happen. If I hit my tab key, watch what happens. What's highlighted? Home. I hit my tab key again. That's what has focus, folks. If I press enter, I go to that page. So you can actually declare that if an object has focus, and I'm guessing that whoever wrote this page actually wrote this in, because usually when you tab through a page, you'll get like a really faint little dotted box, not something that's highlighted blue. But you can navigate through any web page with a tab key and press enter. So if your mouse breaks and your trackpad and you don't have touch screen, you can still navigate with a keyboard. It's kind of interesting. So that's focus. All right, so here's where it gets kind of interesting. These are kind of fun. We actually have pseudo selectors for language. So like if I have a part of my page that might be in Mandarin Chinese or like right to left Arabic or in Hindi or something weird like that, I can actually apply different styles to that. In fact, you might want to do that if the language for something is a certain thing. Now where that happens really often is on foreign language pages. So like if I went to Baidu, what's Baidu? Yeah, that's exactly correct, Joy. It is the big Chinese search engine. It's like the Chinese Google, right? But if you ever go to a site like this, and I know I'm like way zoomed in, right? I can't read that stuff. But if I do a view source, you're going to notice when it finally loads, oops, the Chinese have hacked my machine. Oh, and this is a clever trick. You guys see this? You got the doc type at the top. It looks like there's no code on the page. Oh, wait, there it is. Did you ever see that technique? Yeah. There's no source code. Okay, I'll go. All right, but notice this is a Chinese website. The code is in English. But there will be sections of the page, clearly, where the language is different. So whenever I see a mix of languages, I can apply different styles to the language to highlight it. Okay, that's, I think, kind of a no-brainer. Here's where we get to some of the more interesting ones, and the ones that I think might actually marginally have some value for you in terms of designing, because it does, once again, eliminate the need for putting a lot of attributes into tags. So you can keep, like, your code looking really clean, but still get the effects that you want. And that the exercises in this chapter kind of focus on these a little bit more heavily, because they're the things that you probably don't know. And they're things like if you were taking the certification, they will try to challenge you on. So notice this one. This was kind of fun. So they have these like nth child, only of type, first of type, and we're going to see some examples of these. But the nth child formula one is really the one that's kind of intriguing. And I'm not going to talk about it here. I am going to talk about it later when we get to the exercise. But you have the ability now to actually say, all right, well, if I have a first child, right? It's like your oldest child, right? But when I'm thinking of a child, I would maybe create some code like an ordered list or a div, and then I would put other HTML elements inside of it. First child would refer to the first element that sits inside of something. So if I had div first child, if whatever's the first thing in there is a paragraph, that's what gets the style. It's pretty simple, right? Or you could declare nth child. Did we skip that one? Oh, that, okay. Nth child in formula. But with the nth child, I could actually just select like the third one. Okay, so if I had 4 tags inside the div, the third one gets a style. Now, you guys have to think of scenarios where this might be the case. These types of scenarios typically are content management driven types of scenarios that will output content that will be consistent in format. So for example, if I had a WordPress post, it would probably have a div that would probably have an H1 in it for a title, and it might have a little blurb for the author, a blurb for the date, It might have a paragraph that's an abstract, and then it might have the content, and then it might have a little footnote at the bottom that says, hey, if you want to contact the author, here's their email address, right? That's just kind of a typical scenario. In that scenario, the abstract, you might want that italic. So I could probably say, well, if that's the fourth element or the third element that sits inside that div, I can say div nth child 3 italic. Make the text italic. So that'd be the kind of scenario because the pattern always repeats. And that's where this stuff is actually useful. I don't have to put a class or an ID on that paragraph. It'll just work. So you see the power of it. All right, let's move on. We also have these, and these are kind of interesting list. And notice what it does. See how I got that thing highlighted there where it says inserts generated textual content. Wait, I can use CSS to insert content onto my page? Yes, you can. So in this case that you're seeing here, it says paragraph before content no. So if I have a paragraph that sits in a certain spot, however I find to select it with my CSS, I can actually insert note, colon, before the paragraph appears so that somebody pays attention to it. And the person who wrote the HTML didn't do it. So you can think of scenarios where you'd say, well, why don't you just go back to the HTML and add that word in? What if the person's locked out? What if you can control the CSS, but you can't control the content? Or what if the stuff is dynamically generated based upon what's in a database? That happens too. Because you guys are probably still stuck in the static mentality of websites, but the truth is, you go to like a site like Facebook, where everything is dynamic, right? So they might try to bring your attention to something by inserting content dynamically based upon your particular viewing situation. Like, for example, whether you're logged in or not. Like, how do you think they put those little like icons up at the top of the Facebook page that highlight like you got a friend request? Isn't that like inserting some sort of content? It might just be done this way. It might also be done with JavaScript. That's kind of the interesting part, is sometimes you just don't know. But what we're seeing here is this capability used to only be possible with JavaScript. But now it's being included with CSS. So very, very fascinating. All right. You can also group selectors, folks. So if you have a couple of things on a page that should be styled together, you just put a comma in between the selectors. So this means the button tag will be background white and the paragraph tag will be background white. That's what that means. And yes, you can put a whole bunch of them together. Not a problem. Here's another interesting one. It says subsequent adjacent sibling selectors. Oh my God. Memorize that as a phrase. All right. But notice the little piece there. So that one, so we have an H1 and a div. And it says the following example, the div and the H1 set the heading to a background color of yellow if the heading is preceded by a div as the previous sibling. Now, hold on a second. As a previous sibling, meaning they're both sitting inside the same encapsulation, whatever it happens to be. They're both child elements, and they're sitting next to each other. So you might have like an article or a section tag, and then the div, and then the H1. So both of those are siblings, they're both children to the article tag, and they're next to each other. Isn't that kind of weird? Once again, eliminating the need for classes and IDs. Now what I think is really fun in here is they go through a pretty complex set of examples, and I'm not going to walk through all these because it will take some time because I do want to get to the coding part of things. But they walk through the code, and what I would like you to do, especially if you need support with this, is watch my other lecture videos because I go through it and it's all demonstrated, like how they work and why they work. Here's another one, a subsequent sibling selector. So meaning that the H1 will follow the div as a child element. So that might be right after it or a couple tags later, but it does come after, so it works. Another brand new thing with CSS3 is the ability to actually create selectors based upon the attributes within a tag as opposed to the tag itself or its class or its ID or any other pseudo selectors that we've seen. So notice the way that this is put together. The href is inside of square brackets right after the anchor tag. So what is this code doing? Well, it tells us right there. It says, it demonstrates the use of an attribute selector to locate all of the hyperlinks whose href attribute is defined. Okay, so you guys probably think, well, if I put an anchor tag on a page, it probably has an href, right? You can actually use an anchor tag without. You could use a name and make it a page link. You guys ever do that? Or an ID? Yeah, that's a thing you can do too. But in other words, we are looking for anything that is an anchor tag that has that attribute within it. Okay, if we hover over it, and afterwards, then it will insert the content. This is kind of a weird one. So it also demonstrates combining the attribute with the hover pseudo selector, blah, 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 blah. Notice the use of the attribute function to retrieve the value of the attribute. I think it's kind of bizarre. And they have a couple of examples about this as well. But what it's showing you is that if you were to have an anchor tag that was missing it, and I'm trying to see if they have anything like that here. All right, so I will show you this example. So based upon this code, it says the content, which is the attribute itself, would actually have a background color of yellow. So the link itself would be yellow. Notice that the link, first part of it isn't. What's the part that's actually colored? The link that's the actual code that's inside the anchor tag. So I can put the anchor tag around a piece of text. But what it's doing, this is a little bit of a mind blow because it's kind of deep pretty quick. But what they're doing here is they're generating that when you hover over the link, it then shows you what the link is. I created my anchor tag. If you look at link number 3 up above, this is the stuff that should be shown. But the moment I hover over it, see, hover, after I will insert the content, which is the actual link. So when I hover over link 3, it pops up what the link is and highlights it yellow. That's pretty slick. I would never use it like this. I think it's hideous. But think about this, that you have the capability here to do some kind of neat things, right? Like you can show somebody a link, but have your text look a certain way on the page. That's really cool. It would. Not the second one, because why? It doesn't? No, it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't. It wouldn't work with this one. It would work with the first two, though. So if I hovered over link 1, then it would pop up contoso.com. All right. Some other really kind of neat ones. You can actually drill down and say that if there's a link, there's an anchor tag that's got an href that's exactly that URL, and I hover, then make it background yellow. That's some really powerful stuff, folks. So now we're looking at tags, and we're not just looking at the tag, we're not looking at the ID, we're not looking at the class, we're looking at the attribute. So if an attribute is set, I can trigger CSS with it. Wow, that's really cool. That's some cool stuff. Yeah, they go through a whole series of these, and then you have like these wildcards, right? Which means that in this case, that it may or may not be prefaced with HTTP. This is okay, looking for anything that's got HTTP, but if it found anything that was HTTPS or was not having that, it wouldn't work. That's kind of cool too. Now, how useful you guys might find these, I don't know. Personally, I've never really coded them because I don't see the point. But there's got to be a scenario that somebody thought of that's like, well, if it ends with JPEG in the link, then we'll color it yellow. That's some pretty specific type of stuff. Why would you ever do that? And once again, it's when you don't have control of the other code. Fascinating concept. But it also allows you that if you wanted to apply an effect to an entire website, right? Like if you think of the scenario that if you had a portfolio website for a photographer that is already built out. The last thing I want to do is go back through every link to every photograph and add a class tag to get the link to highlight yellow.
Yeah, that would be the way.
Right? But if I could just go into my CSS and I say if the link ends with JPEG, add the CSS, wow, that's a one-line fix that can be very powerful. So you see the usefulness of it.
Yeah, it's very amazing what CSS can do.
Yeah, and then this one here with the squiggle and the equals means that if it contains that piece of text, so in other words, if you have that text inserted into the link. All right, and I think that you guys are getting the point here at this point in time, but I do also want to point out this, and this is something that most of us don't really think about too much anymore, but in the old days it was certainly a concern, that browsers have their own built-in style sheets. How does an H1 become an H1 and become bold and space around it if there's not some sort of style sheet in the browser, and there is, that designates that? All the browsers have defaults, folks. The default font size for a browser is, whatever's in there. But there is actually a specific size. Do you guys know what it is? 16 pixels is normal. Okay, that's considered a normal font size. What's the normal font for a browser? Times Roman. It is. So you create those ugly first web pages, they're always in Times Roman. And these are built into the browser. What a lot of people don't realize, though, is you can actually go into your browser and go into the settings. And of course, I know Google has changed all this, so I don't even know where to look anymore. But I'm just going to type, like, for example, font, and it should pull it up. So font size, medium recommended. So if I come in here and I say, well, you know what, I want my font that size, I can change it. And what that means is if somebody doesn't designate the size of the font in their style sheet, I'm overriding it right here. And you know what? If they don't designate their fonts, there's also spots where you can actually change what fonts are default. So instead of Times Roman, and I'm going to admit, back in the early days of the web, I was one of those people that hated Times Roman. All the pages were Times Roman, and I'd go in here and switch it to like Arial because I just thought it looked better. Little did I know, I was totally blowing up somebody's design, right, that didn't know any better. But you cannot discount the fact that people can come in here and change these settings. So if you're not specifying styles for, like, for example, all your fonts on the page, you're not designating sizes for all of them, somebody's coming in here and changing it. So the way to avoid that happening is to make sure you style everything. Make sure you apply a font, and make sure you apply sizes and colors. And that's why very often you'll see either as a global selector, a body tag, or even an HTML tag, where people will declare the base font, the base size, and the base color right there. You wonder why you do that? Even if it's the same font that's already in the browser. You do that so that somebody cannot override it. All right. Another thing that's of concern to people is how the styles cascade. So this is actually a little list here that you guys might want to try to internalize. All right. From highest to lowest, in other words, what takes specificity or what takes precedence. If no styles are declared, whatever the browser does by itself is what you're going to get. That's your, like HTML 101, we just made a paragraph in H1, oh boy, right? That's what you get day one when you do HTML. Then you'll see people's declarations in the user style sheet. Now what that means is if I go into my browser and I change those settings I was just talking about. The next one would be in the style sheets that we create, whether it's inline, embedded, or external. Notice that the fourth one's got this keyword here, important. Have you guys ever used that one? You've ever learned about that one? You might see that at the end of some CSS, where sometimes their cascade is like so messed up or broken, or they don't want to spend the time trying to figure it out. It's usually really what the case is. Sometimes we'll put at the end of a line of CSS, exclamation mark important, to make sure that it takes precedence. And I'm going to tell you what, whenever I see that on a page, I go, this person was lazy, is what I always say. Because there's a different way to do it. And it's usually used in a last-ditch effort or to try to get something pushed out really quick. Like, for example, if you go to like a newspaper website and they're just pushing an article out there really quick and they want something to have precedence and they don't want to go into the big style sheet and change it and add all this stuff, they'll just drop it right into the code, usually right in line as well or embedded into the document. And that way they're overriding the global style sheet and not spending a world of time doing it because they just want to get it out there.
I don't know how much page they really actually need to be open page, but one page not actually did this before. What page or way did they run?
It is a way to make sure that something gets what it needs. Yeah, I mean, and for me, it's always a last-ditch effort. And then notice that it's possible for you to actually go in and into your browser and override stuff in the user style sheet for the browser. That's kind of weird. And I very, very rarely have ever seen that. In fact, I can't even think of like a working example aside from somebody demonstrating, you know. So that would mean that you would go into the browser, find the built-in style sheet for the browser, and put in important. I don't know why, but it exists. So that's a possibility. Very, very unusual. All right, folks, this is also a handy little chart that might help you decode some of the specificity things in terms of like what takes precedence. And basically what they're doing is they're working from the global level down to really, really specific. So the more specific you get with IDs, classes, pseudo selectors, sibling selectors, and all that kind of stuff, the more specific it's going to be. The more localized it is, the more specific it's going to be. All right, it's just rule of thumb. All right. At this point, what I would like to do is move on to the exercises and let you guys worry about the rest of the chapter on your own. I know that the other videos cover this stuff pretty well and in detail. So I'm going to stop this video here and we're going to go into exercise mode. So we're going to take about a 2-minute break in class and then start coding.